I started doing comedy kind of just after my 30th birthday. It was what has been described as an early midlife crisis, and I think that's probably right. I thought if I don't do something now, I'll end up probably being a partner in a law firm and earning a lot of money and being unable to get out of that situation, because you tend to live within your financial means. So I would have bought a big house, and I thought, well, let's just try it. And I did my first ever stand-up gig, 5 minutes at the Stand Comedy Club in Glasgow, and it was awful, but it felt amazing. And I thought, this is what I want to do. And then 6 months later, I resigned. Now, that was quite soon to leave your job. The problem was I was in quite a big kind of shiny corporate firm, and clients were coming to see me doing comedy, and it was very difficult to combine being paid, £400 an hour by a client and then them coming to see me, So I thought, well, let's go for it. And I resigned and I went to the Fringe, and 10 years later, it's starting to go quite well. It's taken about that long. It was the best decision I ever made. Even in times when I've earned no money and it's been difficult and horrible, it is absolutely the best thing I've ever done, is to give up my job to be a comedian. My family were very supportive. I suspect privately they were. My mother in particular would have been distressed. I went to a good school, went to a good university, I was a lawyer. She was delighted. I was set for life and suddenly went, oh no, I want to go and be a clown. I think they were quite annoyed. A lot of my friends in law thought I was absolutely mad. A lot of friends thought I was absolutely mad. I mean, people genuinely did. My wife was very supportive and she probably thought it was mad. But people were okay about it, because I think they knew that it was something I either had to get out of my system and come back to law, or it would be a success. And comedy, though, my wife said I had 2 years and then I had to go back to being a lawyer, and luckily she held off a bit longer. It was about 4 years into doing comedy, 4 or 5 years of slogging away, when I started appearing on Radio 4. And that's when things kind of started changing in terms of audiences and what I could do. So it was about halfway in, so about 5 years ago, I thought maybe this is something that I can actually earn a decent living at. But it took a long time and a lot of very bad gigs. I've still got my first cheque I was ever paid as a stand-up. My first ever paid gig, it was £10, and the promoter wrote it in pencil so I couldn't cash it. And I've got it framed on my wall as my first ever payment that I couldn't even cash. I cut my teeth mostly at the stand comedy clubs in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also at the Frog and Bucket in Manchester, and clubs like that, north of England, Scotland, sometimes in London, but the comedy market is quite crowded in London anyway. And London audiences can be quite different, so actually it's quite good to learn in Manchester or Glasgow or Aberdeen. And I learnt by watching other people, really. That's the only way to learn. And not on television, but actually in comedy clubs. So I was very lucky. I started off at the same time as Sarah Millican, Kevin Bridges. When I was at the Stand, Frankie Boyle was a regular compere. Some really amazing comedians. I worked with Jason Manford in a pub in Paisley. And watching other comedians and what they do is absolutely the best way to learn. And I was lucky that I started at a time with some absolutely incredible comics that I could learn from. And when I did, doing something like the news quiz with Sandy Toksvig when she's hosting, there is no better way to learn than sitting beside a woman like that, and Jeremy Hardy, and I've been very lucky to meet some of my heroes like Joe Brand and French and Saunders, and watching them work. That's how you learn, and doing it. So I hundreds and hundreds of gigs, awful gigs, terrible gigs, but they're still gigs. I think coming out at that time, it wasn't the easiest, because I grew up during kind of Clause 28, Section 28 times, where there was a lot of negativity around, and even the most welcoming of people could be tainted by some of the propaganda that was about. I had to come out because I was about 20 and things were getting quite awkward about constantly using non-determinative gender pronouns to discuss what I was doing at the weekend. I had to kind of, well, I'm going out with someone and they're really lovely, and so I thought I have to do it. It was very nerve-wracking. But again, much like giving up my job as a lawyer, if my parents were in any way concerned about it, they never ever said anything, which, good for them. Even if they hated it, they were very supportive at the time. And it is one of the most important things that you can do, and important to do. I always support other people's decisions about whether or not they want to or not, but for me, it was absolutely the most important thing to do. And immediately, as soon as I did it, I suddenly felt like myself, because you weren't hiding who you were any longer. And now I'm just banging on about it all the time. I think there's a lot that they can do, and I have been asked to speak for a number of organisations on both mental health and diversity, in terms of what can be done. One of the things is having an open discussion if anyone has any questions. This is a really important thing, that sometimes people don't ask questions and everyone's frightened and no one talks to each other. And one of the things to do is just simply to have a discussion and say, right, does anyone have any questions about what's going on here? With gender neutral bathrooms, with all of those kind of things, especially in terms of LGBT and transgender rights, you know, sometimes you have to ask a question, and it's okay to ask questions, but also to be really positively inclusive. So if you're having a corporate away day, this used to always quite annoy me. The women would go to a beauty spa and the men would play golf. And you know, those times are possibly gone in terms of diversity, in terms of what people want to do. So it's just about kind of opening your mind. And I think organisations like Stonewall are fantastic. If you have any questions, Stonewall runs some fantastic away days for employers about diversity. But the main thing is to open the conversation. I think you can be both. I'm actually, in many ways, more comfortable at a corporate event doing a speech than I am doing stand-up. I enjoy writing a bespoke speech for a group. I think that's a nice thing to do, if you find out what they like doing. Whereas stand-up is, and this is the problem, people perceive stand-up as jokes. Jokes, your kind of lovely Jimmy Carr. My stand-up isn't necessarily joke, it's funny, believe me, it's funny. But it's storytelling, it's much more like a Billy Connolly observational thing. So sometimes when people talk about stand-up means so many different things. This is the thing, there is no such thing as a stand-up. In the old days, it was a guy on the television telling mother-in-law jokes. Stand-up now is hundreds of things. So if people are looking for a stand-up, they have to be quite careful they're booking the right type of stand-up. I may not be the right type of stand-up for some things, but I am absolutely perfect for others. And it's just about finding out, you know, is it 11 o'clock at night full of guys who just want blue jokes? If that's the case, I am probably not the correct stand-up for you, because I don't do blue jokes. Because my mother would be disgusted with me if I did. Goodness sakes, I've got a law degree. I think the single biggest challenge in terms of corporate bookings is, and I think that my problem is because I used to be a lawyer, I am obsessed with ensuring that I fulfilled the contract and the brief from the client, and often this is my downfall. Sometimes I'm booked because the speaker they had last year was offensive to everyone. And then they go, let's get that nice lady from Radio 4. But the audience still actually wants the offensive comedian. So the biggest challenge for me is fulfilling the brief from the person who's booked me and making sure the audience are happy at the same time. because sometimes the person who books the comedy isn't really booking it for the audience. And that's a difficulty. So a nice person says, we want some just lovely stories, and then you go out and everyone's drunk and they just want some rude stories. And so to me, that is the biggest problem, is making sure I don't disappoint anyone by doing what I've been booked to do, but the audience hate what it is that I'm doing. And there can sometimes be a real difficulty in terms of those two aspects. So you want your company to be a lovely, forward-facing, diverse company, booking a diverse comedian to do nice stories for you. And that is not what your sales team want. And then everyone feels very uncomfortable, especially me. I think it does help because I've been to these dinners as a guest. So I've been to all of these kind of corporate events. So in that way, it's helpful in that I understand that there is a certain process to it, there's a decorum to it, there's a certain order to the whole situation. It makes it worse because I've been to these events and I know what happens at these events. So I think in terms of exploring a client's needs, what I found is when I speak to clients for the briefing call, I completely get it. So I understand what they want from me. The briefing calls are always very, very business-like because of what I used to do. The difficulty can sometimes be when I get there and there's a little bit of a problem there. So it does help, but it also helps frighten me sometimes, I think. But I think it is useful in terms of, especially if you have to sit at the tables and talk to people. I've done small talk in a positive way. I don't mean that in a negative way. When I was a lawyer, I know what these dinners are about. They're about networking. They're about all of those kind of aspects. And I think having a broader view of the world, often when I do company gigs or legal gigs or whatever, I actually often know what they're talking about because I used to be a corporate lawyer. So if they want to talk about their share buyouts, I can, talk about it with them. I find it quite interesting.